A widow's grief turned into a battle for justice when a racist funeral director tried to deny her husband a proper burial. But what he didn't expect: Big Shaq stepping in. As secrets of fraud, discrimination, and corruption unraveled, the town was forced to pick a side. And when Briggs made one final desperate move, Shaq delivered a checkmate no one saw coming. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The scent of polished wood and fresh-cut lilies lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the grief that hung heavy inside Briggs & Sons' funeral home. The parlor was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of paper and the muffled sobs of a grieving woman sitting alone near the front desk. Shaq had seen loss before. He had attended enough funerals, offered enough condolences, but something about Eleanor Parker sitting there, her frail hands clutched around a crumpled bill, didn't sit right with him. The widow's eyes, puffy and red, darted up as the funeral director, Walter Briggs, shuffled a stack of papers with an air of impatience. "Ma'am, I don't know what to tell you," Briggs said, barely masking his disinterest. "You need at least $5,000 up front before we can even set a date. That's just how things work." Eleanor's lips quivered. I just need more time," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband served this town for 30 years. Can't we work something out?" Briggs sighed dramatically. "Mrs. Parker, this isn't a charity. We have policies." Shaq, standing near the entrance, had heard enough. His massive frame filled the doorway as he stepped forward, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "I'll cover the cost," he said simply. Eleanor's head snapped toward him, eyes widening in disbelief. Briggs, on the other hand, stiffened. "And who are you supposed to be?" Briggs sneered, giving Shaq a once-over. "Just someone paying respects," Shaq said, keeping his tone even. "I want Mrs. Parker to have nothing to worry about. Whatever the bill is, put it on me." Briggs scoffed, shaking his head. "That's real generous of you, Mr. Shaq," he said, extending a hand. Briggs didn't take it. He crossed his arms instead, his lip curling slightly. "Right. Well, Shaq, I don't do handouts. Especially not for people who—" He hesitated, glancing at Eleanor, then back at Shaq. "Who can't afford it themselves." Eleanor flinched as if she had been struck. Shaq's jaw tightened, but his expression remained calm. "It's not a handout. It's respect. The man just passed, and his wife is grieving. You've got the space, the staff, the casket. What exactly is the problem?" Briggs leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough for only Shaq to hear. "The problem is, I choose who I do business with." Shaq's eyes darkened. He knew that tone. He had heard it before in different places, different words, but always the same message. "This is about something else, isn't it?" Shaq asked, keeping his voice low but firm. Briggs smirked. "You tell me." Eleanor's fragile sob broke the quiet. "Please," she whispered. "I just want to bury my husband." Shaq took a slow breath. "You're really going to turn down money in full?" Briggs shrugged, feigning indifference. "You don't belong in my business, and neither do they." Silence. The weight of that unspoken truth settled into the room, thick and suffocating. Shaq exhaled sharply through his nose, his patience wearing thin. "So what happens now?" Briggs leaned back against his desk, smirking. "Unless Mrs. Parker comes up with the money herself, the body stays right where it is." Eleanor let out a quiet gasp. Shaq's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay composed. "You know this ain't right." Briggs smiled, smug. "That's not your call, is it?" Shaq held his gaze for a long moment before nodding once, slowly. "All right." Then he turned to Eleanor and gently touched her shoulder. "Come on, ma'am," he said softly. "We'll find another way." Eleanor wiped her tears with trembling hands, casting one last heartbroken glance at Briggs before letting Shaq guide her out. As they walked toward the door, Briggs called after them, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Good luck finding someone else willing to take her kind on such short notice." Shaq didn't stop walking, but his jaw locked and his broad shoulders tensed. He knew what Briggs meant, and he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The heavy silence inside Briggs & Son's funeral home was suffocating. The polished mahogany desk between Shaq and Walter Briggs felt less like furniture and more like a battle line. Eleanor Parker sat quietly in a chair to the side, her frail hands clenched together in her lap. Her face was streaked with silent tears, but she refused to look broken, not in front of a man like Briggs. Shaq, standing tall, his massive frame looming over the office, kept his voice measured but firm. "Look, man, I'm not here to argue. I just want to pay what's owed and make sure Mrs. Parker's husband gets the funeral he deserves. Name your price." Briggs, leaning back in his chair, laced his fingers together, his smirk smug and unbothered. "You don't get it, do you?" he said smoothly. "This isn't about money." Shaq exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the words before they were even spoken. Briggs gave a casual shrug, his expression dripping with arrogance. "People like you think cash fixes everything. But some things money just can't buy. And class, that's one of them." The words hung in the air like a thick fog. Eleanor flinched slightly but didn't look up. Shaq stayed still, his eyes locked on Briggs. His entire life, he had seen men like this. Men who used power not to help, but to control. Who measured worth not in humanity, but in bloodlines and bank accounts. Shaq wasn't about to let that slide. "So let me get this straight," Shaq said, his voice slow, deliberate. "You got a grieving widow here, trying to bury her husband with dignity. You got a man standing in front of you offering to pay every last penny. And your problem is what, exactly?" Briggs leaned forward, a glint of amusement in his cold blue eyes. "My problem, Shaq, is that I decide who gets buried here. And I don't like outsiders coming in and thinking they can call the shots." His voice dipped lower. "Especially your kind of outsiders." Eleanor gasped softly. A murmur rippled through the room. Several funeral home employees, who had been quietly arranging paperwork near the back, froze mid-movement. A few townspeople, who had wandered in after hearing whispers of the confrontation, exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke, but the tension in the room grew thick enough to choke on. Shaq held Briggs's gaze, his own expression unreadable. He could feel the eyes on him, waiting, some in fear, others in hope. "You sure you want to do this?" Shaq asked quietly. Briggs chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't scare me, big guy. What are you gonna do? Throw a fit? Demand a protest? Call up the media?" He scoffed. "You think people around here care?" A few bystanders shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Briggs smirked, emboldened by the silence. "This town runs on tradition, and folks like me, we've been in charge of that tradition for generations. You might have money, but you'll never have the kind of power I do." Shaq studied him for a long moment before responding. "Power?" he repeated. "You think this is power?" Briggs leaned back, smug. "You tell me." Shaq tilted his head slightly, exhaling through his nose. Then, without raising his voice, without a single ounce of anger in his tone, he simply said, "Nah, this is fear." Briggs's smirk faltered. "You're not running a funeral home," Shaq continued. "You're running a gate. Deciding who gets dignity, who gets respect, who gets to be remembered." He let the words settle before adding, "That ain't power. That's weakness." A few whispers stirred in the crowd. Briggs's jaw tightened. "This is my business, my rules," he snapped, "and I don't owe you or anyone else a damn thing." Eleanor, who had been silent, suddenly stood up. Her voice shook, but her determination was unmissable. "My husband was a good man. He worked for this town, paid his dues, raised his children here. He deserves to be laid to rest just like anyone else. You think denying him a burial makes you powerful?" She let out a sharp breath. "Number, it makes you small." Briggs's eyes flashed with irritation. "I don't take business advice from—" Shaq took a step forward. It was slow, controlled, but the entire energy in the room shifted. Briggs shut his mouth. Shaq didn't need to raise a hand. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply let his presence fill the space. "You want to hold on to your rules? Fine," Shaq said, his tone even. "But understand something, Briggs. The world is watching now. Briggs's face twitched. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Shaq looked toward the crowd, toward the employees, the onlookers, the townspeople who had stayed silent for too long. And then, one by one, the phones came out. People had been recording. A young woman in the back held her phone high, her screen showing the live feed of the confrontation. The number of viewers? Already climbing past 10,000. Briggs noticed it too late. His smirk disappeared. His skin drained of color. You want to talk about power? Shaq said. Let's talk about what happens when people see you for who you really are. The murmurs grew louder. A funeral home worker lowered his clipboard, suddenly uncomfortable. A town elder, who had been silent until now, took a small step forward. Briggs's fingers tightened into fists at his sides. He looked around, suddenly realizing he was losing control. Y'all really gonna let him come in here and... No one answered. No one defended him. Shaq watched Briggs grapple with the realization that the very town he claimed to own was slipping through his fingers. Shaq let the silence drag for a beat before speaking again. So what's it gonna be? Briggs opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes darted between the phones, the silent employees, the people who had once feared him but were now seeing him in a different light. For the first time, Briggs had no answer. Shaq nodded once, then turned to Eleanor. Come on, ma'am. We're not done yet. And with that, he walked out. Not as a man who lost, but as a man who just shifted the balance of power. Briggs stood frozen in his own funeral home, realizing too late that the ground beneath him was starting to crack. And for the first time in his life, Walter Briggs was afraid. Word spread fast. By the time Shaq and Eleanor left Briggs and Son's funeral home, whispers had already started floating through town. At the grocery store, at the diner, at the gas station, people murmured about what had just gone down. Some dismissed it as nothing more than a rich outsider stirring up trouble, but others, especially those who had suffered in silence for years, felt something different. For the first time, Briggs had been challenged. For the first time, someone had stood in front of him and said, no. At a small cafe near Main Street, two women sat across from each other, speaking in hushed voices. I heard that basketball player tried to cover the whole funeral, one of them said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. And Briggs still turned him down? The other woman asked, shaking her head in disbelief. Wouldn't even take the money. Can you believe that? Across town, an older man, Joseph Harrington, sat on a wooden bench outside the barber shop, listening as his grandson scrolled through his phone. Grandpa, look, the boy said, holding up a live-streamed video of Shaq's confrontation with Briggs. Joseph squinted at the screen, watching the footage play out. The way Briggs sneered, the way Shaq remained calm but unshakable, the way Eleanor sat in quiet humiliation, clutching her hands together, as if trying to make herself smaller. The old man exhaled sharply, a shadow crossing his face. Ain't the first time Briggs pulled something like this, he muttered. His grandson looked up. What do you mean? Joseph tapped his cane against the pavement, his voice low. Your grandmother, when she passed, he tried to overcharge me double, said it was policy. I didn't have the money, so I had to take a loan from the church just to give her a proper burial. The boy's jaw tightened. Why didn't you say anything? Joseph let out a bitter chuckle. Because back then nobody would have listened. But now the whole town was listening. Eleanor sat in her small, dimly lit living room, staring at the wooden box of ashes she had planned to avoid. She had made up her mind. If Briggs wouldn't release her husband's body, maybe it was better this way. Maybe it was better not to fight anymore. A cheap, unmarked burial somewhere out of sight, out of mind. Wasn't that what Briggs wanted? Wasn't that what this town had forced on others like her before? She swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She had spent her entire life being quiet, making herself small. Maybe it was time to accept that. Then, a knock at the door. She hesitated before opening it, already knowing who would be standing there. Shaq. His broad frame filled the doorway, but his presence wasn't imposing. It was steady, reliable. He wasn't here to argue, or to make her feel guilty. He was here to fight for her, even if she couldn't fight for herself. You don't have to do this, Shaq said gently, glancing at the box of ashes. Eleanor's hands trembled. "I can't go through that humiliation again," she whispered. "I can't stand in front of that man and beg him to let my husband rest." Shaq nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "Then don't." She blinked at him. "What do you mean?" "You don't have to beg. And you're not doing this alone," Shaq said. "We're going to find another way." Eleanor wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that there was still some fight left in this town. In her, in the people who had watched too many times as Briggs got away with it. But the years had made her tired. "I don't have your strength, Shaq," she admitted, her voice breaking. Shaq knelt slightly, so his eyes were level with hers. "You don't need mine. You got your own." For the first time that day, Eleanor felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. While the town buzzed with conversation, Briggs tightened his grip on his business. He had been in this game too long. He knew how people talked, how they ran their mouths for a few days, then forgot all about it. Shaquille O'Neal? He'd leave soon enough. Just another celebrity who thought he could come in and play hero. But Walter Briggs? He was the one who lasted. Sitting behind his desk in his office, Briggs pulled out an old ledger book, flipping through pages filled with names and numbers. He had overcharged so many families it was almost funny. Some had scraped together everything they had, only to be forced into debt. Others had quietly walked away, just like he expected Eleanor to do. But Shaq was a problem. Briggs drummed his fingers against the wood, thinking. If he was going to keep control, he had to make an example out of this. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. When the person on the other end answered, Briggs leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. "We got an issue," he said smoothly, "and I need it handled." That night, as the town's unease grew, an unexpected voice stepped forward. A former employee of Briggs, Derek Lawson, sat in a dimly lit diner, scrolling through his phone. His hands were sweaty, his knee bouncing under the table. He had seen the footage. He had seen Briggs' face as Shaq called him out, and he knew the truth. Briggs had been scamming families for years. Derek had watched him forge invoices, had heard him tell grieving customers that they needed extra fees that never existed. He had witnessed bodies left unclaimed, because families simply couldn't afford the price tag Briggs had placed on their loved ones. And now, someone had finally put the pressure on him. His heart pounded. He knew that speaking up meant making himself a target. But maybe Shaq was right. Maybe this town had been silent for too long. With a deep breath, Derek opened his messages and typed a name. Shaquille O'Neal. Then, he started to type. And just like that, the first crack in Briggs's empire had officially formed. The morning air was crisp, the kind that carried whispers of change. But inside Briggs and Sons' funeral home, Walter Briggs sat behind his massive oak desk, fuming. The town was talking, and for the first time, they weren't whispering in his favor. Shaquille O'Neal hadn't backed down like Briggs expected. He hadn't disappeared, hadn't moved on. Instead, he had done something no one saw coming. Shaq had bought his own burial land, a sprawling, peaceful plot of land just outside town. And then, he had announced to the world that struggling families wouldn't have to worry about funeral costs anymore. The headline ran in the Daily Gazette. Shaquille O'Neal funds free funerals for families in need. No one gets left behind. Briggs stared at the newspaper in his hands, his knuckles turning white. His own business, the empire he had controlled for decades, was being undermined in a single stroke. Shaq hadn't just found another way, he had built a better one. At Mary's Diner, the town's usual morning rush felt different. Conversations weren't about the weather or football scores. People were talking about Shaq's funeral.